In the early 1870s, a photograph was taken at a railroad platform somewhere in the American Midwest. The exact town is not recorded. The image shows a group of children standing in a line beside the tracks. There are 37 of them. That number appears handwritten on the reverse of the photograph in fading ink. 37 children gathered in one place, waiting. They are dressed in heavy coats that do not fit. Some sleeves hang past their hands. Shoes are mismatched. One child appears barefoot. Their ages vary widely. A toddler stands beside teenagers nearly grown. No personal belongings are visible. No luggage, no bundles, nothing that suggests recent family life. What stands out most is not what is visible, but what is absent. There are no parents in the frame. No adults claiming the children as their own. No mothers standing behind them. No fathers nearby. Only one adult appears at the edge of the image, partially cropped. He is dressed formally, likely an agent. His role would have been to accompany the children from the train to their destination. His name is not recorded. Photographs like this appear across the Midwest in the decades following. 1854, Iowa, Kansas, Illinois, Missouri. The details change slightly, but the structure remains the same. Groups of children, similar numbers, similar spacing, similar absence of family members. The year 1854 matters. In September of that year, the first orphan train departed New York City. It carried between 30 and 45 children, depending on the source. That range appears repeatedly in contemporary records, train after train, group after group. By the year before that first departure, New York City officially recorded more than 34,000 homeless children. The number comes from municipal reports and charity surveys. It was widely cited at the time. Urban poverty had reached levels reformers considered unsustainable. One of those reformers was Charles Loring Brace. In 1853, he founded the Children's Aid Society. His stated goal was to remove children from city streets and place them in rural environments where they could be raised with structure, labor, and moral guidance. The idea was not framed as adoption in the modern sense. It was framed as opportunity. According to official accounts, the system worked through cooperation with churches, towns, and families across the country. Children were transported by rail. Local committees assisted with placement. Oversight was claimed to exist through follow-up visits and correspondence. That is the framework provided in most historical summaries. But when the physical evidence is examined, questions emerge. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 to 250,000 children were relocated through this system. That estimate comes from the Children's Aid Society itself and later historical reviews. It represents one of the largest child relocation efforts in American history. Despite this scale, there is no centralized federal registry of the children involved, no complete list of names, no unified record tracking placements, outcomes, or deaths. Documentation exists in fragments, annual reports, local newspapers, scattered census references, but the continuity is missing. Census records from 1870 show noticeable population increases in rural towns that received orphan train children. At the same time, local birth records often do not reflect corresponding increases. The population appears to arrive rather than be born. This discrepancy is not universal, but it occurs frequently enough to be noted by later researchers. Age distribution adds another layer. Records confirm that children as young as 2 years old were placed with farming families. Teenagers were placed alongside them. Sibling groups were often separated to improve placement efficiency. Names were sometimes changed upon arrival. In some cases, children lost all record of their original identity. Newspapers from the period report arrivals in simple terms. Dates are precise. Numbers are precise. Details about the children themselves are minimal. On March 12, 1875, the Iowa State Register reported that 37 children arrived by rail. No names were printed, no origins listed, just the count. Similar reports appear across Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois throughout the 1870s and 1880s. In 1880, the Kansas farmer noted that children were chosen as laborers more than sons. This observation was not framed as scandal. It was presented as fact. In the background of many photographs, towns appear already established. Brick buildings, stone foundations, churches, schools, rail stations constructed to last. Yet, census data suggests rapid population growth only after the arrival of relocated children. The infrastructure appears older than the population supporting it. Public placement events were common. Children were presented in town halls or community buildings. Families examined them and made selections. This process was documented and openly discussed at the time. It was considered practical. By 1904, more than 40 states had participated in the program. Nearly the entire country was involved. The operation relied heavily on private charities and religious organizations, with limited government oversight. In the early 20th century, criticism grew. Reformers questioned the lack of regulation. States began developing their own child welfare systems. Gradually, the trains stopped running. In 1929, the last documented orphan train journey took place. After that, many records were sealed, adoption files closed, original documentation lost or destroyed. For many descendants, the paper trail ends at a train platform. The photograph remains. It does not provide answers. It does not accuse anyone. It simply records a moment that was once considered ordinary. Children waiting, numbers written down, identities left behind. To understand what this system was and what it was not, the official explanation must be examined carefully. Its logic, its assumptions, its omissions. Only then can the gaps be identified. But let's examine what we've been told. The official explanation for the orphan trains begins with a crisis that few historians dispute. By the early 1850s, American cities were overwhelmed. Immigration surged. Industrial jobs drew families into crowded neighborhoods. Disease, accidents, and poverty left thousands of children without stable homes. In New York City alone, official counts in 1853 recorded more than 34,000 homeless or abandoned children. They slept in alleyways, doorways, and crowded lodging houses. Reformers described the streets as breeding grounds for crime and illness. Charles Loring Brace believed the city itself was the problem. In 1853, he founded the Children's Aid Society with the stated mission of removing children from urban environments and placing them in rural homes. Brace argued that country life would offer discipline, work, and moral instruction. He rejected large orphan asylums, which he believed institutionalized poverty. Instead, he promoted relocation. Children would be sent west by train and placed with families who needed help and were willing to provide food, shelter, and supervision. The first orphan train departed New York City in September of 1854. It carried a group of children ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers. Accompanying them were agents from the Children's Aid Society. Upon arrival in receiving towns, local committees, often organized through churches, gathered families interested in taking in a child. According to the official narrative, placements were voluntary on both sides. Children were introduced to families. If both agreed, the child stayed. If not, the child continued on to the next town. This process expanded rapidly. As word spread, towns across the Midwest requested children. Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio became frequent destinations. Trains typically carried between 30 and 45 children, a size considered manageable by agents. By the late 1850s, the system was running continuously. The Panic of 1857 worsened unemployment and homelessness, increasing the number of children sent west. The Civil War further intensified the situation. Between 1861 and 1865, deaths, displacement, and economic instability produced thousands more orphaned or abandoned children. The Children's Aid Society and similar organizations viewed relocation as both humanitarian relief and national necessity. Rural America needed labor. urban America needed relief. The orphan trains appeared to solve both problems. Oversight, according to official accounts, existed through follow-up visits and correspondence. Agents were expected to check on placements. Families were supposed to treat children as members of the household, provide education, and prepare them for adulthood. The arrangement was often described as apprenticeship rather than adoption, especially for older children. Younger children, officials claimed, were more likely to be fully integrated into families. By 1870, census data reflected declining numbers of homeless children in some eastern cities. Supporters pointed to this as evidence of success. Annual reports from the Children's Aid Society highlighted placement totals and favorable anecdotes. Children were described as thriving farmers, shopkeepers, and homemakers. These success stories became central to the public image of the program. The scale continued to grow. By 1875, states like Iowa recorded peak placement years. Kansas reported thousands of children received by 1,880. Rail networks made long-distance transport increasingly efficient. Some children traveled more than 1,000 miles from their city of origin. By the turn of the century, over 40 states had participated in the program. Criticism existed, but it remained secondary in official histories. Some religious leaders objected to Catholic and Jewish children being placed with Protestant families. Others questioned whether families used children primarily as labor. Reformers responded that work built character, and that conditions were still better than city streets or institutions. As the progressive era began, new ideas about child welfare emerged. State governments developed foster care systems. Laws regulating adoption and labor expanded. The orphan trains gradually declined as responsibility shifted from private charities to public agencies. In 1929, the final documented orphan train journey took place, marking the end of the movement. In mainstream history, the orphan trains are remembered as a flawed but compassionate response to extraordinary circumstances, a product of their time, an early attempt at social welfare before modern systems existed. Historians acknowledge abuses and failures, but emphasize intent over outcome. The program is often described as saving children from starvation, exploitation, and crime. This explanation is coherent. It is supported by reports, speeches, and contemporary praise. It fits within broader narratives of 19th century reform. It offers a reason for the trains, the numbers, and the urgency. But it leaves questions unanswered. Questions about records, about identities, about scale, about what happens when numbers grow faster than documentation. Those questions do not disappear within the official narrative. The evidence, however, tells a different story. Photographic evidence from the orphan train era is limited, but what survives is consistent. The same scenes repeat across different states and decades. Children grouped together, platforms, town halls, rail stations. The details change, but the structure remains. The first piece of visual evidence comes from arrival photographs, taken in Midwestern towns during the 1870s. These images show groups of 30 to 40 children standing in lines, often in front of train depots. The children are arranged deliberately, shorter children in front, taller ones behind. This is not accidental. It suggests preparation. Someone organized these groups before the image was taken. What we would expect to see in family placement photographs is variation. Parents stepping forward, individual moments, movement. Instead, the children appear uniform, still waiting. There is no visible interaction between children and local families in these images. The moment captured is not adoption, it is presentation. The second set of images comes from public selection events held in town halls and churches. These photographs are rare, but written descriptions confirm what they depict. Children standing on raised platforms, adults seated or standing below. The children are visible. The adults are evaluating. Hands are examined. Teeth are checked. Posture is assessed. This contradicts the idea of private family placement. If the goal was emotional integration, public inspection seems counterproductive. Yet this practice was common enough to be mentioned casually in newspapers and reports. It was considered efficient. Children who were not chosen moved on to the next town. The third category of visual evidence involves group portraits taken after placement. These images show children standing beside adults who are identified as guardians. However, the ages often do not align with adoption norms. Teenagers appear alongside toddlers in the same household. Clothing remains mismatched. The children do not share family resemblance or surnames. Captions rarely list names. What is most striking is the absence of personal history. There are no visible traces of origin, no heirlooms, no family photographs carried from before. 4 children relocated from poverty. This may seem expected, but for 200,000 children, the complete absence of transitional artifacts is notable. The fourth visual pattern appears not in the children themselves, but in the environments they enter. Photographs of receiving towns show infrastructure that predates recorded population growth: brick buildings, stone churches, large schools, rail stations constructed for sustained use. These structures appear permanent, not provisional. Census records show that population increases follow the arrival of orphan-trained children. The buildings, however, are already there. The visual record suggests towns ready to receive people before those people are officially recorded as living there. This contradiction appears repeatedly. Towns in Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri display mature infrastructure in photographs taken shortly after receiving large numbers of children. Yet, census data indicates those towns were previously sparsely populated. The physical environment does not align neatly with the demographic timeline. Another anomaly appears in transportation images. Trains carry children without families, but with agents. The agents are often formally dressed. They appear consistent across regions. Their presence suggests centralized coordination. Yet no centralized photographic archive exists documenting their identities or routes. If oversight was extensive, visual documentation would likely reflect that. Instead, what we see are fragments, unlabeled images, undated prints, group shots without context. The visual trail breaks, just as the administrative trail does. Even the clothing tells a story. The children are dressed well enough to be presentable, but not comfortably. Coats are oversized, shoes are worn. This suggests preparation for display rather than daily life. Enough effort to meet public standards, not enough to suggest long-term care before placement. When these images are viewed individually, they appear unremarkable. When viewed together, a pattern emerges. Standardized group sizes, repeated arrangements, consistent absence of family members, similar presentation across states and decades. What is missing visually is just as important. There are no photographs of children being reunited with relatives, no images of parents consenting to placement, no transitional scenes between city life and rural life. The story jumps from departure to arrival. In historical documentation, photographs often serve as confirmation. They show that something occurred as described. In this case, the photographs confirm movement. They confirm organization. They confirm scale. They do not confirm identity. They do not confirm consent. They do not confirm continuity between past and future. This gap between what we expect to see and what is preserved is consistent with other aspects of the orphan train record. Visual evidence supports the fact of relocation. It does not support the simplicity of the official explanation. When images from different regions are placed side by side, they appear interchangeable. A group in Iowa could be mistaken for a group in Kansas. A platform in Missouri resembles one in Illinois. The children blend into the system. This uniformity raises a question. If placements were personal and individualized, why does the visual record appear standardized? The photographs do not accuse, they do not explain, but they do reveal repetition. And repetition suggests process. And the documentary record confirms these suspicions. The paper trail surrounding the orphan trains appears extensive at first glance. Annual reports, census tables, newspaper articles, charity summaries. But when these documents are examined together, a pattern of gaps begins to form. Not isolated errors, not missing pages from a single archive, repeated absences across multiple systems. The first set of documents comes from the Children's Aid Society itself. Annual reports from the 1850s through the early 20th century list placement numbers with precision, totals per year, totals per state, occasionally totals per train. In some years, the reports claim hundreds or even thousands of successful placements. What they rarely include are outcomes. Names disappear after placement. Follow-up reports are described, but not preserved. Long-term results are summarized, not documented. For example, reports from the 1870s highlight successful placements in Iowa and Kansas. Yet individual records from those states rarely include arrival names that match later census entries. The children appear in aggregate statistics, then dissolve into local populations without traceable identity. The second body of evidence comes from the United States Census. The 1870 census recorded significant population growth in rural counties that had received large numbers of orphan-trained children. This growth often occurs within a single decade. However, when birth records from those same counties are examined, the numbers do not align. Births account for only a portion of the increase. Migration explains some of the rest, but in many cases, the math remains incomplete. Census schedules from 1870 and 1880 also reveal inconsistencies in age reporting. Children appear in households with ages rounded or altered. Surnames change between census years. In some cases, a child appears in one census and disappears in the next, without death records to explain the absence. The third set of documents comes from newspapers. Local papers across the Midwest reported orphan train arrivals with remarkable consistency. Dates are exact, numbers are exact. March 12, 1875, 37 children arrive by rail. Another report in Kansas notes 42 children arriving on a single train. These articles rarely include names, rarely list origins, almost never mention parents. The newspaper coverage treats the arrivals as events, not as personal stories. The children are counted. They are welcomed by committees. They are placed. Then the story ends. There is no follow-up reporting on individual outcomes, no tracking, no accountability beyond the day of arrival. The fourth documentary layer involves adoption and placement records at the state level. In the early 20th century, many states sealed adoption records retroactively. This included orphan train placements. Once sealed, these records became inaccessible to researchers and descendants. In many cases, original documents were destroyed after new identity papers were issued. This practice effectively closed the loop. Children who had already lost original names were given permanent replacements. Their previous identities became legally irrelevant. For genealogists, this creates a sudden wall. Family lines terminate at the train platform. The timing of these closures matters. Sealing often occurred decades after placement, when surviving children were adults. By then, many original witnesses were gone. The paper trail, already thin, became permanently fragmented. Another anomaly appears in jurisdiction. The orphan trains crossed state lines continuously. Yet, child welfare laws at the time were state-based. This created a gray zone. Children moved faster than legal frameworks. Responsibilities shifted between private charities and local committees. No single authority retained full oversight. This diffusion of responsibility appears repeatedly in documents. When abuse was reported, accountability was unclear. When children disappeared from records, no agency claimed authority to investigate. Each organization held only part of the story. There is also the issue of scale versus administration. Relocating 200,000 children over 75 years required logistics comparable to a national operation. Rail coordination, scheduling, housing, placement agreements, and yet the documentation remains decentralized and inconsistent. For an effort of this size, the administrative footprint is surprisingly light. Some critics at the time noticed this. By the 1890s, reformers questioned the lack of regulation. Reports called for standardized records and state oversight. These criticisms appear in social work journals and legislative debates, but by then, the system was already well established. When the documentary evidence is layered together, a pattern emerges. Numbers are emphasized, outcomes are summarized, identities are minimized, continuity is not preserved. The paper trail confirms that children moved. It confirms when and where trains arrived. It confirms the scale of the operation. What it does not confirm is what happened to individual lives over time. This mirrors what the visual record shows: movement without continuity, arrival without origin, placement without long-term trace. Taken together, the documents do not disprove the official narrative. They support parts of it, but they also reveal structural weaknesses, gaps that repeat across states, decades, and institutions. And these patterns do not remain confined to one region or one country. These patterns appear far beyond one location. When the orphan trains are placed in isolation, they appear unusual but explainable. A response to poverty, a product of reform, a uniquely American solution to a 19th century crisis. But when the same structure appears elsewhere, under different names and in different countries, the explanation becomes less complete. In Canada, a similar system operated for decades, beginning in 1869 and continuing into the 20th century. Tens of thousands of children were relocated from Britain to rural Canadian communities. They were known as British home children. Like the orphan train children, they arrived by ship and rail. They were placed with families. Their labor was expected. Oversight was minimal. Identity changes were common. The numbers are striking. By the end of the program, more than 100,000 children had been relocated to Canada alone. Many arrived without parents. Many were renamed. Many left behind little documentation linking them to their place of origin. Descendants today encounter the same dead ends faced by orphan train families in the United States. In Australia, child migration schemes followed a similar pattern. Beginning in the early 20th century and continuing through the mid-century, children were sent from Britain to Australia. The stated goal was opportunity and care. The reality often involved labor, isolation, and identity loss. Once again, records were incomplete, oversight fragmented, outcomes uneven. In the United Kingdom itself, earlier systems show the same structure. Workhouse children were redistributed to rural areas. Foundling systems transferred infants through institutional networks. Names were altered, ages adjusted, family ties severed. These practices were normalized as solutions to poverty. Across these systems, the same elements repeat. Large-scale child relocation, private or semi-private organizations acting across jurisdictions, limited centralized records, emphasis on numbers placed rather than lives followed. Children treated as movable populations rather than individuals with continuity. This repetition raises an important question. Why does the same solution appear independently across multiple countries and decades? One possible explanation is necessity. Industrialization produced poverty faster than governments could respond. Children became the most visible symptom. Relocation was cheaper than long-term institutional care. Labor needs in rural regions provided incentive. From this perspective, the similarity is coincidence driven by circumstance. But there is another framework that some researchers consider. This alternative view suggests that child relocation programs functioned as population redistribution mechanisms during periods of demographic instability, economic collapses, epidemics, wars, migration waves. In this framework, children were not only being rescued, they were being repositioned. This does not require a single controlling authority. Systems can emerge through shared assumptions. The belief that children are adaptable, that identity can be reassigned, that populations can be stabilized by moving the young. Within this framework, the orphan trains make a different kind of sense. Rural towns with existing infrastructure needed people. Urban centers needed relief. Children were the most flexible demographic group. They could be integrated quickly. They could grow into place. This perspective also accounts for the gaps in records. If the goal was placement rather than preservation of identity, detailed documentation became less important over time. Names served a function. Once that function was fulfilled, the past could be set aside. It also explains why similar systems appear globally. Different countries, different charities. The same solution to the same structural problem. This framework does not claim malicious intent. It does not require secrecy or coordination across borders. It suggests something more subtle, a shared response to disruption, a method that worked well enough to be repeated. It also explains why these systems faded, as state welfare programs expanded, as record-keeping improved, as the ethics of identity and consent evolved. The practice became harder to justify. The trains stopped running, the ships stopped sailing, the records were sealed. What remains are fragments, photographs, numbers, census tables, newspaper notices. Enough to show that something happened, not enough to show exactly how it shaped the people involved. If this framework is correct, then the orphan trains were not an anomaly. They were part of a broader historical pattern, one that treated children as solutions to demographic imbalance. And if that is the case, the implications are not limited to the 19th century. If this framework is correct, the implications are profound. If the orphan trains are understood only as charity, their story ends quietly, a flawed effort, a product of its time. A chapter closed in 1929. But when the evidence is placed together, the photographs, the records, the numbers, the silences, the story does not end so easily. One implication is demographic. The relocation of 200,000 to 250,000 children did not simply move individuals. It reshaped communities. Entire rural populations were stabilized within a single generation. Towns that lacked sufficient birth rates gained labor, students, and future families almost overnight. This raises a question rarely asked. Were these communities growing naturally or being sustained artificially? A second implication concerns identity. Many orphan-trained children were renamed, surnames altered, birthplaces forgotten. In some cases, ages adjusted. Over time, the original identity ceased to exist on paper. This was legal, accepted, even encouraged. But identity loss on this scale has consequences. Family histories were severed. Cultural continuity interrupted. Entire lineages became untraceable. A third implication involves records themselves. History relies on documentation. When records are missing, sealed, or destroyed, interpretation becomes fragile. The orphan train system operated largely without centralized oversight. That fact alone is not sinister. But it means that what survives is incomplete by design. What we know is shaped by what was preserved. What we do not know may be just as significant. A fourth implication is ethical. Children were relocated across state lines with minimal consent standards by modern definitions. Public selection was normalized. Labor expectations were implicit. Abuse occurred in some placements, documented by reformers themselves. While many children undoubtedly found stability, the system accepted loss as an acceptable cost. These implications do not require a single hidden plan. They do not depend on secret coordination. They emerge naturally when scale exceeds accountability, when urgency overrides continuity, when numbers matter more than stories. It is important to acknowledge uncertainty. Not every child suffered, not every placement erased identity. Some families provided genuine care, some children thrived. Any honest examination must hold that complexity. The evidence does not support a single outcome. It supports a pattern. That pattern invites reflection rather than conclusion. What does it mean when populations can be moved so quickly, with so little record, and then absorbed into new identities? What does it say about how societies respond to crisis? About who is considered adaptable? About whose past can be set aside for the sake of stability? These questions are not confined to the 19th century. Systems change, language evolves, justifications improve. But the underlying tension remains: how to manage disruption, how to preserve order, how to decide whose history matters. The orphan trains no longer run. The rail lines are quiet. The children have long since grown old or passed on. What remains are traces: a photograph at a platform, a census anomaly, a sealed file, a missing surname. History often feels solid: dates, names, timelines. But beneath that surface are decisions made under pressure, compromises accepted as necessary, stories simplified so that systems can function. The orphan trains sit at that intersection, between care and control, between rescue and replacement, between memory and erasure. There may never be a final answer. Records are gone. Witnesses are gone. Motives cannot be reconstructed with certainty. But the evidence that remains is real. It can be examined, compared, questioned. That is all historical inquiry can do. The evidence exists. The questions remain. What do you see?